Okay, welcome everyone. We're on Clapham Common. That's where we are right now. The history of Clapham is interesting and there are some very well-known people who lived in this area. But of course we're here mainly to talk about Roald Dahl, who was born in South Wales in September 1916, died in November 1990 in Oxford, but he lived part of his life and wrote a lot of his work in this area. A writer of, obviously, both children's fiction and short stories for adults. He's best known as the author of the 1964 children's book Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. He also wrote the script for the 1971 movie version, and he's been described as many things, but definitely described as a master of story construction and a great ability to weave a tale. As I said, he was born in Llandaff, South Wales, to Norwegian parents, September 13th, 1916. Spent his childhood summers visiting his grandparents in Oslo, and by all accounts he was a mischievous child, full of energy, and from an early age he proved himself skilled, it seems, at finding trouble. He wrote an autobiography of his childhood, and it was called Boy, and he says his earliest memory was seeing an older kid riding a bike down a hill without holding the handlebars, and it had an effect on him. He then himself used to go to school at a very fast speed on his tricycle, with his two sisters struggling to keep up as he whizzed around on two wheels around corners. His father passed away when he was 4 years old, and his mother followed her late husband's wish that Dahl be sent to English schools. He first attended Llandaff Cathedral School, and he began a series of unfortunate adventures. He and several other students were quite severely beaten by a principal for placing a dead mouse in a storekeeper's candy jar. His mother moved him to St. Peter's boarding school, later to an area called Repton, with an excellent private school. And he later described his school days as days of horrors, filled with rules, and still more rules that had to be obeyed. And it inspired much of his gruesome fiction. Though he wasn't a good student, his mother nevertheless offered him the option of attending either Oxford or Cambridge when he finished school. His reply, which he mentioned in his autobiography, Boy, Tales of Childhood, was no thank you. I want to go straight from school to work for a company that will send me to wonderful faraway places like Africa or China. This in front of us, by the way, is the Clapham Air Raid Shelter. And during the Blitz from 1940 to 1941, Londoners, well, they naturally sought shelter wherever they could, including underground stations. The government weren't that keen on that idea. The public were protesting for better provision of shelters, and therefore they ordered the construction of a series of deep level air raid shelters along the Northern Line, tube line. London Transport was judged to be the only organisation capable of the project because they had many TBMs, tunnel boring machines. And 8 were built in total, and this was one of them. Each of them were able to hold 8,000 people. And this shelter consists of two 400-metre or 437-yard long tunnels with an upper and a lower section. They called them underground palaces. This is what the government called them. Seems a bit generous. So the shelters had rows of triple-tiered bunk beds, but the sheltering people had to bring their own bedding. So they had to drag their mattresses down all of the stairs. There were no lifts. And should you want to get a shelter back in those days, you had to get a ticket from your council. The ticket would then assign you to a section and a bed. Also, there was a medical centre, washing facilities, a canteen. And music was often played over the PA system. And they would encourage dancing and a community atmosphere. It was, for a while after the Second World War, known as the Penny Hotel. It was used as a cheap hotel, and in the late 1940s, some of the migrants that disembarked from the Empire Windrush from the Caribbean, they were put up here until they could be found somewhere else to stay. So the history of Clapham itself is interesting. It began as a Saxon village. Its name was originally Clapham, which meant the village, which is Ham, by the short hill, which is the Clop. And at the time of the Domesday Book in 1086, a Norman named Geoffrey de Mandeville held Clapham. To us, medieval Clapham would have seemed a tiny place with a population of fewer than 100 people. So even by the standards of that time, Clapham was a small village, and it remained for many centuries a small farming settlement. And then in the late 17th century, it expanded. It began to grow. Refugees from the Great Plague of London in 1665 and people who were left homeless by the Great Fire of London in 1666 moved here. So by the end of the 1600s, Clapham was quite a large village. And then in the 1700s, the late 18th century, it became a really fashionable place for the rich to live, as it was pretty close to the amenities of London, but it was in a rural setting and it was away from the dirt and the noise of the city. In the 18th century, lavender was grown in a lot of the fields, and it was used to make perfume. And it's where one of the most famous roads in Clapham, Lavender Hill, got its name from. Back to Roald Dahl. When he graduated from Repton, he took a position with the Shell Oil Company in Tanganyika, now Tanzania in Africa. In 1939, he joined the Royal Air Force, a training squadron in Nairobi, serving as a fighter pilot in the Mediterranean during World War II. And he suffered quite severe head injuries in a plane crash near Alexandria in Egypt. And upon recovering, he was sent to Washington, D.C. to be an assistant air attaché, who was, I suppose, a technical expert who would just advise the government representatives. And there he began his writing career, getting published a short story in the Saturday Evening Post, and soon his stories appeared in many other magazines. Dahl told the New York Times Book Review years later that as I went on, the stories became less and less realistic and more fantastic, but becoming a writer was pure fluke. Without being asked to, I doubt if I'd ever have even thought of it. So it kind of happened by accident, he says. In 1943, he wrote his first children's story, and it was called The Gremlins, and he invented a new term in the process. Gremlins being small creatures that lived on fighter planes and bombers and were responsible for all the crashes. Through the 1940s, 1950s, he continued to write short stories for adults, establishing his reputation as really a writer of deathly tales with unexpected twists. And his stories earned him 3 Edgar Allan Poe Awards from the Mystery Writers of America organization. Still on Clapham Common. Lovely area, lovely and green. It is a bit louder here in general, but I've got the sound off, which would maybe disturb the narration of this. There are a lot of cars, and we're near the South Circular, the A205, which circles London. So as I mentioned, quite a few distinguished people have lived in this area. In 1700, the famous diarist Samuel Pepys, P-E-P-Y-S, retired to Clapham, and he lived in a house on the north side of this common, Clapham Common. Henry Cavendish moved to Clapham in the 1780s. He was a rich man, a reclusive man, but a very brilliant scientist. And he was most well known for conducting experiments on gases here on the common. And he also firstly calculated the density of the earth. An American man named Benjamin Franklin stayed in Clapham for a while in the 18th century too. He lived in London for 16 years on Craven Street, just near Charing Cross, but stayed here for a while. And he experimented by pouring oil on the water of a pond here on Clapham Common. Captain Cook's widow, Elizabeth Cook, lived in Clapham in the 1780s. She was 94 when she passed away, and she outlived all of her 6 children as well as her husband. The village of Clapham was the focus at the end of the 18th and early 19th century, a focus of a group of evangelical Christians. They became known as the Clapham sect, and many of the members of the Clapham sect campaigned for an end to slavery and cruel sports. Among the leading lights were John Venn and Henry Thornton, Zachary Macaulay, John Shaw, and a great man named William Wilberforce, who campaigned very strongly against the slave trade. He lived in Clapham for a time, but he moved closer to Parliament. There are more plaques for William Wilberforce in London than any other famous figure. Also in the 19th century, Charles Barry, the architect who designed much of the Houses of Parliament, lived in Clapham. And John Bentley, who designed Westminster Cathedral. This is the Windmill, one of the loveliest pubs in the area, and a very historic place as well. There have been many mentions of old windmills in London. 1 or 2 still exist in places like Wimbledon Common, about 20 minutes drive from this walk. But for some, this Windmill pub is known to have given its name to an old windmill that was around here from 1665. Exactly where it stood, well, that's been lost in the mists of time. And there was a man named Thomas Crenshaw who began selling beer here in 1665, and we think the pub is named after the windmill that he sold his beer outside. And it became a staging post, unsurprisingly, for coaches. Even though this was still a rural track, it wasn't a beaten track. We use the word beaten track or beaten path. The Romans were grinding down lime plaster and nutshells and beating them down into the ground with mallets or hammers, creating a nice track for horses and for carriages. So they would call that the beaten track. But this was really off the beaten track. There's a Piccadilly theatre known as the Windmill, and there's a Great Windmill Street. But as I said, we believe that there was an actual windmill here in the middle of the common, where the breeze could come from every angle from the mid-1600s. 1953, Roald Dahl married a Hollywood actress, Patricia Neal, the star of such movies as The Fountainhead and later Hud, which she won an Academy Award for. And although sadly the marriage didn't survive, it produced 5 children. And as soon as the children were old enough, Dahl began making up stories for each of them, each night before they went to bed. And these stories became the basis for his career as a children's writer. And it began seriously with the publication of James and the Giant Peach in 1961. And it tells a fantastical tale of a young boy who travels thousands of miles in a house-sized peach, and he's travelling with a strange group of companions. Dahl insisted that having to invent stories night after night for his kids was perfect practice for his trade. He said again in the New York Times book review, "Children are highly critical and they lose interest so quickly. You just have to keep things ticking along. If you think a child is getting bored, you must think something up that jolts it back, something that tickles. You have to know what children like." Which I think is fair enough, and it seems that his work encapsulates all of that. He had rules for children's books. 8 major rules. Number 1, just add chocolate if in doubt. Number 2, adults can be scary. Number 3, bad things do happen. Number 4, revenge is sweet. Number 5, you have to keep a wicked sense of humour. Number 6, take perfect pictures. Number 7, films are fun, but books are better. And number 8, it appears in so many of his short stories and his books for adults and children, food is fun. A school teacher said about him, he had never seen somebody get so many words wrong. It was almost like he was inventing them. Now they say that William Shakespeare invented words. We don't necessarily know that he invented words. We know that thousands of words were first in print in the works of William Shakespeare, but maybe he just hung around the markets and the shopping exchanges and heard the words and used them. But we definitely know that Roald Dahl created many words, maybe by just originally getting them wrong. When he was a young lad, he was with a group of kids in Wales, and he was drawn towards a sweet shop, and Mrs. Morgan ran it. He said years later she didn't smile. The kids couldn't resist the pear drops, the tonsil ticklers, the bullseyes, the gobstoppers, the jawbreakers. It was a great era for candy, for sweets. And the boys put a dead mouse in the gobstoppers, and they called it the Great Mouse Caper of 1924. And that kind of trick, cruel but funny, kept with him throughout all the stories that he worked on over the years. The themes in his work, the cruelty of adults, the unjust punishments, the love of sweets, the love of adventure, and his life as well. Some of it was very sweet, some of it very, very sour. Probably created his most interesting character, Willy Wonka, owner of a chocolate factory, a kind of guy that you wouldn't really want to know. You wouldn't want him as a family member, but he was intriguing, terrifying, and yet fun at the same time. I was going to say at the beginning of this tour, we have so much time and so little to get through. Reverse that. That was one of Willy Wonka's great phrases. There aren't many children's writers that you could build a theme park around. Of course, the Harry Potter series, Beatrix Potter, Roald Dahl. You could literally write musicals, you could make films, and you could have an amusement park based on their work. He's not James Joyce, he's not Thomas Hardy, he's not D.H. Lawrence, but in his work he treats adults like kids and kids like adults. And some of the best children's stories are very, very dark. There were some controversies in his life, of course. He was accused of saying certain things. Some people said he was anti-Semitic, or he certainly made comments. His two closest friends and business associates were both Jewish men, and they said that he was like a child. He said things either that he didn't mean, or that because he had no filter, he would say them, throw away, and then regret them straight away afterwards. And sometimes he chose the wrong words. I'm not using that as an excuse, but that's what a couple of his friends said. It sort of brings us back to that boy in school and the teacher's report. Sometimes he says the wrong words, the opposite words, just for the effect. The house we're outside right now is the house of Graham Greene, Henry Graham Greene, born on the 2nd of October 1904 in Berkhamsted, Hertfordshire. He died on the 3rd of April 1991 in Switzerland. His first novel was The Man Within, and it got a mild reception, but it was favourable, and it made him quit his job as an editor at the Times and take up journalism as a full-time profession. And then he started to write. He didn't consider himself a strict Roman Catholic, but the theme for most of his famous novels has been, well, one of the main themes has been the Catholic religion. So The Heart of the Matter, Brighton Rock, and The End of the Affair always use Catholicism as one of the main story threads. And he lived here. Trinity Hospice is a bit further up, the oldest hospice in the UK, founded in 1891, providing wonderful palliative and end-of-life care for patients. And in 2018, Trinity Hospice cared for 2,500 patients and provided pre- and post-bereavement for support for over 900 carers. Mary Kendall is here. She was one of the most famous and certainly long-lasting stars of the music hall era. Born in Bethnal Green, and she was 5 years old when her father took her to the local pubs, and she would sing heart-rending songs, persuading the sentimental and drunk customers to put money in the collecting tin. And then her parents sent her for singing lessons. By the time she was 15, she had toured with her parents in France and the UK and she would often perform as a male impersonator. She took on many pantomime roles and made a lot of money and was very, very famous. She would perform 7 halls, 7 different music halls a night, some weeks. She toured all over the world. And in her 60s, she retired, and she lived out her retirement just here at Oakhover Mansions. And that plaque was from 2011. The Music Hall Guild of Great Britain and America, they erected the plaque to her. He is, of course, an author who did, as I say, have these controversial views, which he then regretted and then said he just said the wrong thing at the wrong time. And there seem to be a few of them in the world over the years. An artist who breaks our heart a little when we know something of their private lives. There are 2 ways of looking at it. Either we don't read them or we don't engage in any of their work. Or there's another way, that we're choosing who to read, and we're not choosing who to celebrate with a picture or a photograph on a stamp or a statue. I heard a good quote about Star Wars. If every character in Star Wars wrote literature. Now Luke's might be good, Yoda's might be good, but you'd rather, I suppose, read Darth Vader's novel or listen to Jabba the Hutt's grunge album. I love Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I love Danny, Champion of the World. He did write amazing stories that stay with us, and there always seems to be a trusting adult in amongst the adults that aren't that nice and are a bit cruel. You've got Grandpa Joe, you've got Miss Honey, and he really thought about the stories. He said that 2 hours of writing fiction left him absolutely drained. For those 2 hours, he had been miles away. He had been somewhere else, in a different place with totally different people. And the effort of just swimming back into the normal surroundings is almost a shock. And he said, a fool is a person who decides to become a writer. The only reward you get is absolute freedom. And a writer has no master except their own soul. And that, I am sure, is why they do it. My favourite quote is, well, Charlie in the Great Glass Elevator, and it's a little nonsense now and then is relished by the wisest men. You can't get simpler than that. And this is where he lived. On Turnchapel Mews. He called it his little piece of London. He wrote the BFG and Matilda here. Although he had a house in Oxford, he was writing here for many, many years. If we went further down the road, we'd be near Battersea Power Station and Vauxhall near the US Embassy. But this seems, outside Turnchapel Mews, to be the best place to take you back into the room and see my face.